Story 1. My stepmom and my dad used to work opposite shifts there for a while. He was on nights, her on days. They had a set of baby monitors from when my sister and I were babies. My dad said they could record short messages with them, and they would leave them out on the coffee table for the others to hear when they got home from their shift. This went on for a bit, then once their shifts lined up, they put the monitors away in storage. She died of cancer at a young age, and my dad had just gotten back from the funeral and was home alone. He spent that night going through their things, packing some of her stuff away. He said he had one of the baby monitors sitting out on the coffee table, and it woke him up in the middle of the night with an old message going off on repeat that she had recorded. It said, "I love you, Mike, I love you, Mike," over and over. My dad told me he just sat on the couch in the dark and listened to her message until the batteries died. A couple of weeks later, he had picked us kids up for the weekend. After my sister and I went inside, he said he was sitting on the porch smoking, and a strong gust of wind blew, and he said he could smell the perfume that she always wore. It scared me to hear those stories as a kid, but now I can see the beauty and peace in those experiences. Story 2. This just reminded me of a small occurrence that I had when I was a teenager. I was home alone for the weekend. My parents had a memory foam mattress on their bed, so it was infinitely more comfortable than mine. I decided to sleep in their bedroom and enjoy that comfy bed on night one, even though I knew they hated it when one of us kids would do that. I settled down to sleep and felt immediately unsettled. I have anxiety, so I just told myself I was feeling off because of my new surroundings, that I was super comfy, and once I fell asleep, I'd be fine. I turned on the TV and watched some old cartoons. Once I was ready to sleep, I turned off the TV and put the remote on the nightstand by my head. I rolled over and did my best to fight the unsettled feeling I had. I woke up to the light from the TV shining on my face and the cartoons playing again. I was confused, but whatever. I probably just fell asleep and never actually turned the TV off. I glanced at my phone and it was only about 45 minutes after I went to bed. So I just turned off the TV again and set the remote back on the dresser. I fell back asleep pretty easily because I was groggy already. I was half asleep, woken up a bit by loud conversation. As I woke up more and more, I became disturbingly aware the TV was back on. I rolled over to face it, and it was playing this scene where a bunch of people was sitting around a table talking about something. One of the first things I realized after I woke up more was that the TV volume was incredibly loud, and I had it set pretty quiet before going to sleep. I watched for a minute, confused about how the TV got back on and what was playing, since it wasn't the same channel I left on before I went to sleep. I reached for the remote, and my hand touched the solid wood of the dresser. Telltale horror movie music starts playing softly in the background of the scene as it pans around the room, and I'm fully awake, feeling around the floor for the remote control that I must have knocked off of the stand in my sleep. I'm starting to shit bricks due to the now insanely loud, suspenseful music, and the TV turning on by itself on a different channel. I decide I have to turn on the lights, so I jump out of bed and take about 5 steps towards the door when I see the remote. On the floor, pointing in a straight line from where I was standing to where the light switch was. I make a weird sound between a yelp and a cry, flick the lights on and grab the remote, turning down the volume to a reasonable level. It was completely maxed. I checked to see what show was playing, and it was some older horror movie playing on a movie channel. I bug out of the room as fast as I can and just leave the TV on in superstition. Who am I to judge if someone else is trying to enjoy the empty house with me? Took me a long time to fall asleep in my bed that night. Asked my parents if they ever had problems with the TV turning on randomly at all, and they looked at me like I was super dense. After that, I never tried to sleep in that room again. Story 3. I lived in a haunted apartment. It was 2 rooms, but one of the rooms was locked and I didn't have the key. So I only had one small room, like the kitchen, dining room, and bedroom, and a screened-in porch. There were 2 especially freaky events. One night, my girlfriend slept over, and she woke up in the middle of the night and said she saw the bathroom door open and a shadowy figure standing in the bathroom staring at her. The bathroom was right across from the locked room. Another time, I was jerked awake by the fire alarm going off, just blaring. But when I went to unplug it, the alarm stopped and no other alarm in the building was going off. A lot of the things that happened could have been just my neighbors, but the way they happened was, well, weird. I would hear knocking. It sounded like someone tapping a spoon on a counter, coming from the downstairs apartment. It could have been my neighbor, but I'm not sure why she would do that every couple of minutes for hours on end or in the middle of the night. I would also hear knocking on the walls. It sounded like someone tapping their way up the wall, like they were looking for a stud. I would also hear this weird moaning howling that I couldn't trace the source of. Again, could have been a neighbor's dog, but it didn't sound like it was coming from her apartment. The apartment across from me had 3 tenants in a year. I think because it was just as or more haunted than mine. I think, a unique way of coping. I named the ghost Pete after a previous tenant's mail I would get from time to time, and I tried talking to him, basically treating him like a roommate I wasn't friends with. My girlfriend was much more freaked out by the situation than I, and stopped coming over after a few months. So I wasn't there much anyway. I felt that talking to Pete made the atmosphere of the whole place much more friendly. I also left out a sheet of paper with Pete's notes written on it and told him if he had any problems, just write them down. I still don't know if I quite believe in ghosts, though I find the supernatural fascinating. That experience did push me closer to the science doesn't know everything about. Story 4. This happened when I was 17. When I was still living at my childhood home, I was sneaking out late at night to meet some friends. I went through the back door of the house, and as I turned to face the door, I could just feel somebody watching me. I thought I was busted. I turned to look at who had caught me and saw a monochrome figure. The hair was completely black, blacker than black. Her face was like a static washed over white gray, and she was wearing a dress that was in between the two colors. No facial features, just the silhouette of a young girl facing me. I reached for the door as fast as I could, and when I went to shut it, closed very quickly on me. I bolted through my yard and onto the street and couldn't shake the feeling I was being followed. I stayed with my friends that night. Soon after this happened, I was up late with my mom watching a movie. My dad had just passed away. We finish our movie up and say goodnight after turning on the TV, stereo receiver, and DVD player, all with their remotes. After a short amount of time in bed, I am jarred awake by the sound of static with the speakers cranked up and the TV on with no input. My mom and I meet in the hallway, surprised to see that we had both been awoken to an empty house. A few years ago, when I was 23 and graduated from college, I finally told my family about the first occurrence. Before I can finish my description of the ghost, she finishes for me, telling me that she and her friend used to see a little girl in our backyard playing in a sundress. She said that she looked maybe 12. Our neighbor, who was the original owner, shared a story with us about the family that originally bought the house after it was built. It was a young family whose daughter passed away from leukemia. She would have been about the right age. Looking back, the girl wasn't scary or harmful. My sister had the same impression. To this day, I believe what we saw and haven't seen anything like it ever since. Story 5. My grandfather was a bad man. Alcoholics, extremely violent, tried to kill my grandmother in front of their kids. One of his less horrible acts was abandoning my grandmother with their 6 kids, all under the age of 12. Some of his kids maintained minimal contact with him. He lived about 30 or 40 miles from my grandmother and the 2 kids who'd stayed in the area. When he was in his 80s, he was hospitalized and then passed away in the middle of the night. In the morning, his oldest child, one of my aunts, went to the morgue to identify the body and fill out paperwork. On her way, she stopped by my grandmother's to break the news. When she came in, my grandmother said, "Oh, it's a sad day. He died just past midnight, I imagine." My grandmother had begun to show some signs of dementia or just basic old age, and so the weird comments weren't too out of character. And my aunt assumed that at the hospital, one of her siblings had already called to tell their mother the news. My aunt shook it off and drove to the morgue. When she saw the death certificate, she was shocked to see the time of death listed as 12:10 a.m. On her way home, she stopped back at my grandmother's and asked her who had called her to tell her the news, and asked why she said that she thought he died just past midnight. My grandmother said he came to see me at 12:30 and we talked for a spell. He wanted to apologize for all he'd done to me and your kids. I think he made his peace and was able to move on, so I'm glad for that. My grandmother then resumed humming and doing a jigsaw puzzle. Story 6. I saw my deceased ex-husband in my kitchen. I was watching TV in my living room in the middle of the day and kept hearing this sound like someone was jiggling their change around, and it was loud as if it were in the room with me. I paused my TV, yet the sound persisted. So I start to look around the room, and when I got to the kitchen, I saw him standing there. He was looking around as if taking stock of my apartment. Oh, and he was jiggling change in one hand while flipping a quarter in between his fingers with the other hand. Something he did a lot when he was alive. He turned his head and saw me frozen, staring at him. The expression on his face was known I would never forget. His eyes got huge and he kind of tilted his head forward with the expression like, "You can see me?" I don't know how long we stared at each for, but I turned away when I started to hear my cat ripping up the fucking carpet again in the other room. When I turned back to my ex, he was gone. It's worth noting that he had only been dead for a couple of months too. Some Romanian women I worked with told me that the dead stick around for 3 months before crossing over. I don't know about all that, but I know without a shadow of a doubt what I saw that day. Story 7. I used to be in the military, and the training camp bunk that we lived in was said to be haunted. Occasionally, our stuff would go missing and reappear in weird places, like under our bed, or inside a bag that we had zipped up and stuff. No big deal, right? I mean, human error and all. Then came the instance that freaked everyone out. It was one night after lights out and my friend was on his phone texting his girlfriend. Most of us were drifting off to sleep and were lying on our beds, etc. Suddenly he heard the shuffling of feet from the corridor, so thinking that it was our sergeant, he quickly hid his phone under his pillow, rolled over on his side, and pretended to sleep. To this day, what happens next chills me to the bone. While he pretended to sleep, he heard someone right behind him, at the other side of his bed, going, "Don't worry, you can continue to pretend to sleep." I would dismiss this as a figment of his imagination, except about 5 other people around him heard it as well, including me. Creepier still, there was no one there, and it was the voice of a little girl that said it. For reference, our training camp was in the middle of an island and was set up away from the main admin blocks. The island has been closed by the government for Army training purposes for the past 15 years, so there were no civilians around, let alone kids. To make matters freakier, when we came back from our weekend home leave, there was a bunch of female hair on his bed, neatly bundled up, long and jet black. Under his pillow was a note, "Remember me?" Now, as I said, we were in the middle of a forest, in the middle of an island. And then there were no female recruits personnel on the island. Our bunks were locked up for the weekend, and the duty sergeant had no idea that the incident happened. We never spoke about it after that night. Still chills me to the bone thinking about it. Story 8. I was running on the trails at the Nathan Hale homestead, 18th century farmhouse and property of a Revolutionary War hero, in CT, which is only about a 10-minute drive from my grandmother's lake house. I could not find a map of the trails anywhere online, and there didn't seem to be any signage at the place. Just a bunch of random mountain bike trails in the woods. I was only going to run 4 miles, so I estimated that I would run for about 30 minutes, using my watch to keep myself on track. So I ran around the trails for a while, and nothing seemed too out of the ordinary. It was about 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, and the only sounds were the distant hums of Route 31, birds chirping, and the occasional squirrel or deer that scampered off whenever I came near. The trails seemed to wind around a lot, and if not for my better-than-average directional skills, humble brag, I could have easily gotten lost. About 20 minutes in, I saw something strange about 50 meters off a finely polished, light-colored wooden coffin. I was a little weirded out, to say the least, and waited until I got closer for a better look. I rounded a corner where several old tree stumps blocked my view, only to find that the coffin had disappeared. Where it should have been was a clump of ferns. Odd. I turned around shortly thereafter and made my way back to my car. I was maybe a half mile out when I heard a very distinctive knocking on a nearby tree to the rhythm of "Shaving a Haircut." Talk, 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 except no 2-bits. I was a little spooked, but chalked it up to being a woodpecker or something. However, not 30 seconds later, there it was on a completely different tree, up ahead somewhere. Tok talk to tutok. I picked up the pace. The trail widened a little and I could see the way ahead of the entrance to the parking lot where my car was. There it was again, on a tree seemingly right next to me. Tok talk to tutok. I truly started freaking out and started to book it back to the lot. I was nearing the opening when time seemed to slow down. All of a sudden it felt like the temperature dropped about 20 degrees. The birds stopped singing, and my simple Timex watch started to malfunction, making all sorts of beeping noises and the numbers glitching on the screen. The beat sounded impossibly loud this time, like it was hacked into every surrounding tree with a hand axe. Talk, talk to talk, talk. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me as I anticipated hearing the 2-bits refrain and perhaps worse. I burst into the parking lot and everything went back to normal. The temperature was back in the mid-70s and birds were chirping away. I looked at my watch only to discover that it had gone completely blank. I stood there and stared at it until it flashed 12 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. Monday 1.01, January 1st. My watch had reset itself. It had never done this before. I got into the car and started the engine. The clock on the radio display read noon. That couldn't be right. It should have been around 9:30 or 9:45 at the latest. I put her in reverse and backed up to where I could make my way out to the main road. However, as I was about to throw the car into the drive as it sat there, I heard a sharp rapping sound on the back window, like someone hitting it with their knuckles. Toke, tock. There was no one else in the parking lot when I had finished my run. No cars, no nothing. I didn't dare look back and hightailed it back to my grandmother's house. I have no idea what could have caused this series of events and still cannot explain it to this day. Story 9. I've had quite a few scary incidents happen to me, but these are the top 5 scariest. 1. I had just gotten done working out in my basement and was too lazy to go upstairs and use my normal shower, so I decided to use the one in the basement. As I was shampooing my hair, I heard a little girl singing outside of the bathroom door. Mind you, I was home alone. I turned the water off and called out to see if anyone was down there, and it stopped. I put the water back on and was rinsing off when it started up again, but this time it just sounded like humming. I ran upstairs with shampoo still in my hair and never used that shower again. 2. My brother, my ex-boyfriend, and I was home alone one day, and my ex and brother were playing video games in the basement. They came back upstairs and we were all sitting on the couch talking when we heard a loud bang in the basement. My ex, of course, sent me to go check out what the noise was. When I went downstairs, all the lights were on and there was a box that had been resting securely on a table against the wall in the middle of the floor. 3. That same ex and I were hanging out in the basement one day watching Stand By Me when we heard running behind us. Thinking it was my dog, my ex called out her name, but she wasn't down there at all. So we were a little spooked, but kept on watching the movie. A few minutes later, I see him look behind me with a terrified expression, so I turn around and see a flesh-colored blob dart into the laundry room. We left for the night, and he never went back to my basement again. 4. I was home alone one day while my dad was working, and the rest of my family was upstate. I kept hearing running up and down my basement steps and up the stairs to my grandma's part of the house. It was so loud that my dog eventually started to bark, and I had to call my friend to come to hang out with me. When my dad got home from work, he went into the basement and came back up right away, demanding to know why the picture of Jesus was upside down. I hadn't done it, and when the rest of my family came back home, they all said they did not do it either. My grandma and mom are religious, so they would never dream of doing something like that. 5. My cousins and I went away for the weekend 3 years ago, and were staying at this little hotel by the water. I slept with one of my cousins in one bed, and my other cousin, her sister, slept in the other bed. In the middle of the night on our last night there, I heard a loud bang as if something had fallen, followed by a little girl laughing and footsteps. The cousin who I was sharing the bed with screamed bloody murder and shook me to see if I heard it too, which I was pretending I hadn't, and my other cousin slept through the whole thing. The next morning, she told us she had a weird dream that a little girl was running around the room, pushing our stuff off the table. Story 10. There I was bored in the combat zone, Iraq, drawing a picture. It was of the scenery, a few hills, some dead grass, and a tree stump. On the stump, I decided to draw a creature, a humanoid, like a pygmy werewolf, 4 foot something with claws and teeth. The commander shows up, calls us in for a mission, and I put away my drawing. Weeks later, we are in an abandoned base, staying in some new buildings, no windows, doors, or anything, just the concrete bones and openings for the installation of these things. Every night we have to set up a watch. It takes the whole platoon to cover the building, minus a few per floor, to run to reinforcements. I was one such reinforcement, sitting in an empty room in the dark. After a while, I noticed that I'm not alone. I look up and the thing I drew is sitting on the ceiling, staring at me. I stared back, gripping my M249, waiting for something to happen. When my team leader comes in, asking if I'm okay, as I tell him yes, he walks over to one of the holes where the window would be, looks out, turns back and asks, "Did you see that?" Later, near the Iran border, we stayed at another abandoned base, a bunch of classrooms spread between 6 buildings. All are one floor, with walls that don't reach the ceilings. I had just gotten off a guard shift, came back into my room, and my buddy is in there staring at the ceiling. I looked up, and there it was. Again. "What is that?" my buddy asked. Just then our squad leader comes in asking what we were doing, and we explained, but it was gone again. Never saw it in the country again. Fast forward several years, I got injured in Iraq from faulty equipment, got a medical discharge, and got on with my life. One day I'm in a bookstore and I find this book on demons. I flip through it and there it is. The same thing I drew, the same thing I saw twice at 2 different locations, preceding a personal injury that plagues me to this day, the universe camp.